A nome del Centro Inaudi ho il piacere di darvi il benvenuto alla 26ª Conferenza Fulvio Guerrini, che è stata tenuta quest'anno da Leszek Balcerowicz, di cui vi dirò poi qualche parola qua. Permettetemi un attimo di ricordare le conferenze Guerrini. È la 26ª conferenza, essendo stata la prima inaugurata nel 1984, a 5 anni dalla scomparsa di Fulvio Guerrini, che è stato un grande imprenditore torinese, il fondatore del Centro Inaudi. Le conferenze vennero inaugurate da Raymond Boudon, poi sono proseguite avendo i più grandi nomi del liberalismo internazionale. Ho fatto una piccola ricerca, essendo stato presente quello dell'84 ormai. Credo che dal dopoguerra in Italia non esista nessun'altra iniziativa simile con una tale continuità e con una tale qualità dei relatori. Ricordo tra i relatori Dando, James Buchanan, premio Nobel per l'economia, Alan Ticker, Colin Powell, che ha avuto l'Ipsen, uno dei più celebri politologi del Novecento, che abbiamo avuto ancora Edward Shilts, uno dei più celebri sociologi del Novecento. Abbiamo avuto personalità straordinarie del mondo europeo e del mondo americano. Il tema generale delle conferenze è la libertà nelle società contemporanee, che vi direte non è che sia un gran tema, no, in realtà è lo spirito con cui nacque il Centro Inaudi nel 1962, festeggeremo i 50 anni, il 63. Agli inizi le cose non sempre sono determinate. Sarà festeggiato credo a gennaio, credo il cinquantenario, nato proprio con l'idea di attualizzare il liberalismo. Oggi il liberalismo è un'ideologia piuttosto diffusa, si proclama liberali anche quelli che non sanno di cosa sia il liberalismo. In quell'epoca era un'opinione diffusa, ma non solo in Italia, che il liberalismo fosse un'ideologia del passato, come ce n'erano state tante, e che fosse qualcosa che non aveva più un presente e meno ancora un futuro. La ragione per cui nacque il Centro Inaudi ovviamente era invece quella di sostenere la tesi opposta, che il liberalismo certo era stato un momento della storia dell'umanità. Nella città di Cavour evidentemente non c'è bisogno di ricordarlo, l'influenza storica del liberalismo, ma era anche un modo di analizzare la realtà, un modo di concepire i valori della libertà individuale e delle libertà collettive, era un modo di concepire le libertà economiche e le istituzioni. Questa fu la scommessa quando venne fondato il Centro Inaudi nel 1962. Dire che le cose sono andate abbastanza, se non completamente, secondo gli auspici, credo che sia una verità storica. Se noi pensiamo a tutti i processi che ci sono stati a partire dagli anni '80, di liberalizzazioni, di privatizzazioni completi, in Italia in particolare, con 1000 problemi, ma sicuramente il liberalismo ha dimostrato una vitalità straordinaria. Tant'è che oggi, quando si fa eccezione rispetto ai principi liberali, ci si sente in dovere di spiegare perché, mentre allora non c'era il problema di spiegare perché, era esattamente il contrario. Erano gli anni dell'elitizzazione dell'industria italiana, quindi è giunta ad avere 600.000 dipendenti, erano gli anni in cui evidentemente poste, ferrovie, telecomunicazioni, tutto era monopolio dello Stato e si teorizzava che così dovesse essere. Due parole sul nostro relatore. Il professor Balcerowicz è una figura molto simile, veramente molto simile a Luigi Einaudi. È un economista, un grande economista, ha servito il suo paese come ministro, come governatore della Banca Centrale Polacca. È l'uomo che ha messo la Polonia sulla strada giusta dello sviluppo economico, dell'integrazione con l'Europa e dell'integrazione nei mercati internazionali. Come tutti gli uomini d'azione ha forti principi. Non è un pragmatico, nel senso che non è abituato a fare compromessi con le idee. Sono sicuro che ha fatto molti compromessi con la realtà, perché altrimenti non avrebbe potuto fare il ministro né il governatore, ma mai con le idee. È un intellettuale raffinato. Penso sempre, questo per essere un paese ha problemi o no, non si sente mai parlare della Polonia sui giornali italiani, che significa che la Polonia va bene, l'economia, in funziona abbastanza bene, risolve i problemi, che dimostra la relazione che è stata svolta dal professor Balcerowicz ai partiti liberali in Polonia, che è stata un'azione particolarmente importante ed efficace. Adesso è professore e direttore del Dipartimento di Studi Comparati Internazionali della Warsaw School of Economics, e la sua conferenza oggi è dedicata alla libertà economica, la più fondamentale e la più attaccata della libertà. È una tesi che sosteneva anche Guido Einaudi, quindi per i lettori di Einaudi la cosa non è completamente nuova. Il problema delle verità, o delle verità parziali, perché da liberali non crediamo a grandi verità, crediamo sulla libertà parziale. Il problema delle verità economiche o della filosofia politica è che ogni generazione è condannata a riconquistarsene. Il fatto che fosse vero 50 anni fa, i principi vanno attualizzati, vanno ripredicati in un qualche modo, e il professor Balcerowicz è quello che ha fatto nella sua vita, che sta facendo ancora, perché è molto giovane come vedete, quindi ancora lunghi anni di carriera davanti, è proprio quello di riattualizzare i principi del liberalismo nel contesto delle realtà contemporanee, delle società contemporanee. Provenendo da un paese che evidentemente ha avuto difficoltà terribili, ha subito il comunismo per molti anni, ha avuto processi di trasformazione complessi, evidentemente il suo punto di vista è ancora più interessante. So I speak in Italian, but I hope that you understood most of the show, you speak all languages. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Let's start.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for this comparison with Einaudi, which is a great honor for me. The title is to some extent intellectual provocation, but I think it contains a lot of truth. And it is impossible to discuss this without touching upon some fundamental issues briefly. So let me start. These are very important, powerful words, without which we cannot discuss social reality. But each of these words is burdened by a lot of confusion and manipulation. Why? Partly because of some philosophers which have taken the words and have given these words completely different meaning from the previous one, like freedom. And of course because of many politicians who manipulate words, both in democracy and in non-democracy. Okay, thank you very much. Was it clear enough? So nobody is, as you know, against democracy.
Yeah.
Even Stalin was not against democracy. He only named it democracy, people's democracy. Putin is not against democracy either, because it's sovereign democracy. So this is, of course, an example of manipulation of the word. The very word liberalism has been manipulated to some extent or changed. You certainly know that in the United States there was an evolution of this word from original meaning of classical liberalism to social democracy. Now, liberals in the US are completely different from what we call liberals in Europe. And this is why I think it makes sure to try to clarify the original meaning of the words, but not to do it in a very small circle but publicly. And what I'm trying to do is to mention some of these manipulated words. The state, the government, you know that there are some established definitions according to a great social thinker, Max Weber. The state is an organization on a given territory which has or aspires to have a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence, etc., etc. We have a Robert Mosley conception which is not identical, even though it seems to be identical, as an agency for protection of people against physical aggression from other people. But this narrows down, of course. These definitions narrow down the meaning of the state. What about the popular understanding or interpretation, not only in the former communist countries, but in many Western countries, and in most of mainstream economics. The state is treated like being above the human laws, without not underlying and not being subject to any limitations, as though it was inhibited by angels. And to make it in a more pointed fashion, the statements about proper interpretation of the word state, I am using an anecdote. During the Soviet times, there were delegations going from the Soviet Union to, say, United States, and these officials were shocked to see shelves full of whiskey, bananas, and other precious goods. What was the authentic, typical question? What minister is responsible for the supply, provision of these goods? So they could not understand that without a minister, a state, such a good situation could prevail. So one can generalize. The mentality of Soviet officials means that no problem, that they believe that no problem can be solved without the state. And it is pretty strong. Take, for example, welfare state. Many people believe that without welfare state, people would be dying on the streets. People would not send their children to the school, they would buy second car. But they would not care about these needs. So the mentality of the Soviet official is very strong with respect to some services. Now we know that there has been some classics who have clearly expressed the nature of the state. To mention, there were some liberals in France in the 19th century. One of them has expressed an obvious truth was the belief that the state gives what it takes before. And it may give more than it takes, then it agrees. The accumulation of public debt. Or to quote another, I think this is one of the wisest men among presidents. And I think these two sentences express most of the theory of the state. Where the first just says that in a normal society you have some people who attack other people or cheat, etc. So you need an agency to protect people against such an aggression from inside your country or from outside. But the second is more important because it's often forgotten, that government is not inhibited by angels, so you have to control the state, in democracy too. And it is a lack of control of the state, which is at the basis of the problems, because lack of control by some groups, say liberal groups, because the state, as you know, is always pressed by other groups who want the state to give more money or privileges. And if there's imbalance, then who prevails? So in practical terms, the freedom or the role of the state in society, it depends on the balance between two kinds of groups. I come into that. And this is a practical question. This is a classical conclusion. There are two dangerous types of states or tendencies. The first one is clear, that is bad, despotic state, which violates the classical freedom rights. But there's a second kind of the state, dangerous state, a benevolent state which gives too much. This is a distorted or overgrown welfare state. And we know from experience that most of the problems in countries in Europe which have problems are due to this. And people usually understand that despotic state is bad. But not everybody understands that welfare state in an overgrown fashion is bad. Okay. Well, second classical topic, I know there are millions of pages written on this, and I'm not going to quote these thousands of definitions. Most of them add only to confusion, because the confusion is due to the fact that the same word is used to denote completely different things. So just to start, freedom should not be confused with independence of the country, but rather relate to the situation of individuals. Otherwise, one can say that North Korea is a very free country. If we confuse independence with freedom. And second, freedom should not be confused with wealth, and the lack of freedom with poverty. This is the Jacobin confusion. This comes from Jacobins and was taken by Bolsheviks. It's very dangerous confusion, as stressed among other person by Hayek. So I think, first of all, one should say what kind of freedom one discusses. And I am discussing freedom of individual in relation to the state. And I leave aside another issue, freedom of individual in relation to other people which are not organized or represented by the state. You know this distinction by John Stuart Mill. Now, nowadays, it is the first topic, the freedom of individuals in relation to the state, which is very important. And how to define the extent of this freedom? I think very simple. This is the proposal. The more types of actions are declared as crimes, in a broad sense, by the state, the less freedom. And I say crimes not only in the sense of criminal code, but also administrative code, regulations. If you violate regulations, you are going to be punished by the state. So you cannot discuss freedom, and you cannot measure freedom of individual in her or his relationship to the state without saying something about crimes. And here I think the basic distinction is between ordinary crimes and political crimes. Can you imagine? Now, ordinary crimes are usually crimes against other human beings. To some extent they overlap with the Ten Commandments. Not all Ten Commandments are now part of ordinary crimes. Not fortunately, perhaps. But some are. Not to kill other people, not to rob other people, not to cheat, etc., etc. Political crimes are crimes against a regime. And you can discuss it using the example of socialism, communism, if you will. What was characteristic of socialism as a system based on what Marx, Lenin, and Stalin have proposed and implemented? Extremely extensive list of crimes against socialism. And what was a crime against socialism? An attempt to use any freedom. By definition, socialism, Marxian socialism, was a system when private ownership was a crime. Because otherwise you cannot ensure the monopoly of the state sector without declaring private ownership of enterprises as a crime. So it was a crime. But not only that, once you declare private ownership of enterprises as a crime, you have to declare all other freedom actions as crimes. And it was the fact. If you wanted to set up an independent newspaper, you committed a crime. If you organized an independent organization, it was a crime. Not to mention to organize an independent political party. It was a super crime. So the essence of socialism was a very long list of crimes, political crimes, meaning every attempt to use any kind of elementary freedom. And what was necessary for these crimes not to be committed too often? KGB. Otherwise, many people would commit these crimes. So the essence of socialism was a very long list of crimes against socialism, and a very strong position of political police, say KGB in Soviet Union, Securitate in Romania, etc., etc. But not only that, people who were dissidents can be accused of ordinary crimes. So normal penal code would use to punish dissidents. This was the essence of the system, and once the system collapsed, it was a great and positive change in history, in the most positive change perhaps of the 20th century after the collapse of Nazism. And only some Western intellectuals can deplore that. And there are some who deplore that. Now, what about ordinary crimes? I said that there is a certain common list, but countries differ in the length of ordinary crimes across time, and they differ also a long time, across time, space and time. Why do we complain, and rightly so, about regulations? Meaning restrictions on freedom, especially economic freedom. We complain because the list of ordinary crimes is extended by regulations, and then we try to deregulate. Why do we try, rightly so, to deregulate? Because we have allowed regulations to be enacted. When I say we, I say society, of course. Because the pressures of interest groups overwhelms the resistance of liberal groups. And if this is going to be the fact, we will only complain after the fact. So, discussing freedom is discussing action. Really. Well, this is a huge subject, which I am only going to mention very briefly. And you know, this is the central question of ethics, political philosophy, and practical politics. This is the classical position. You can quote John Stuart Mill. But this is just the beginning of the discussion, not the end. Because you have such questions. If the necessary condition to prohibit something is a harm, what harm and to whom? And you have the question of abortion. How do you define human beings? What about harm to animals? What are the trade-offs? Etc., etc. But I'm not going into that. I'm only saying that a discussion about legal limits of freedom it's deeply philosophical and also requires some technical knowledge. For example, if we discuss in vitro, it's a technical branch, also technical knowledge. I'm not going into that. I will only mention the point number 4. Freedom of contract is a central part of economic freedom, or freedom in general. But starting, I think, in 19th century and 20th century, we have a doctrine, I don't know how it is, an image of weaker side of a given relationship. For example, labor and employees are considered by the prevailing doctrine by being structured their weaker side, or consumers. And in the name of this doctrine, they have a lot of regulations. So there's, I think, a certain conflict between freedom of contract and the doctrine of the weaker side of a given relationship, which is not very, I think I've noticed among the lawyers that it is not realized very well. They have forgotten about what does it mean, freedom of contract. And that could be a clash between that and depending on what they call a weaker side. Again, a classic, which said something about being aware of paternalism. But there's a lot of paternalistic regulations, which are not even noticed. And if you don't notice, you cannot progress, at least in Poland. But probably I'm not an exception. Well, in a book which I have published recently in Poland, I try to just sum up certain points which taken together could define a liberal position on the limits of freedom. But of course, we cannot agree that moral or religious norms all of them enter penal code, because we call it theocracy. Second, the second point, I cannot give a very precise definition. What should be the limit? What should be the minimum or maximum or the maximum list of actions which should be considered crimes? But I know that there is an extension of this list, and one cannot stop it only by monitoring and protesting in time. Paternalism should be rather an exception than a rule, if at all. And finally, all liberal thinkers have been stressing the presumption of freedom, which means that the burden of proof should be on those who propose to limit the freedom. And this is okay. The problem is that in practice, if liberal organization not strong enough, this proof would be very weak, and legislation would pass. So it's not enough to form, it's necessary but not enough to formulate something intellectually. This is just the beginning. And then we have to act in the form of vigilant and strong organizations. I understand this is in the tradition of great Italian liberals, including Bruno Leoni, who stressed this tendency of the state or the modern political system to expand, also via legislation. Again, a classical issue. I've noticed, of course, this is not throughout this obvious, but when in popular discussion, people confuse two kinds of inequalities. Inequality of opportunity and inequality of situation. And we just confuse. We define equality of opportunity as a situation where similar people, in the sense of their internal characteristics, have similar chances of realizing their life plans professionally. So, what counts are your internal characteristics and not external conditions. And we know that equality of situation or incomes is completely different. But many people confuse it. It's very interesting, I think it's very intellectually pretty easy to distinguish, because if you ask people, what is the ideal inequality of opportunity? Ideal. And normally, under something they would say zero. So the idea which is very difficult to achieve, but we can define it, that we should strive towards a situation whereby similar people have similar chances to achieve their goals. But people are different. So, and because they are different, not everybody can be a good basketball player or good composer, etc. But similar people, similar chances. If you ask people what is the ideal measure of income inequality, they can't respond. They can guess. Well, not even guess, completely arbitrary. Some people would say everybody should earn more than average. More than average. For some people, this is an idea of social justice. Everybody is above average. So there is a basic difference between these two kinds of inequalities, which is very much confused in the popular discussion. Now I am coming to, I think there are two great classical liberal ideals, a large extent of legal rights and equality of opportunity. And for some people they are in harmony. For example, if you read Milton Friedman, you will realize that he equates. He said, there's no conflict, but there could be a conflict. As pointed out by Roger Pilon, a political philosopher from the US, and this is one example. So sometimes you have to choose between realization of these two ideals. So I'm just mentioning that. But certainly, neither freedom nor equality of opportunity cannot be combined with this popular tendency to try to equalize situations. This is completely different. Until the 19th century, the word rights usually referred to freedoms. So the state, meaning that the government should abstain from certain actions, especially aggression against individuals. Plus one action. Until the 19th century, the rights were understood as freedoms, plus one right protecting people against aggression. Then we had a distinction, I think, between sort of negative rights and positive rights, not to be confused with negative freedom and positive freedom, so something else. And I think we can say that we can distinguish between what I call classical rights and modern rights. Classical rights include liberties, so the state should abstain from certain actions. Plus one classical positive right, so the state should do something. By definition, negative rights do not require that the state does something, abstains. For example, a classical right of the freedom of speech does not require that the state supplies everybody with megaphone. No, should not censor. Abstention. While protecting people against physical aggression requires the state to have police, etc., etc. So this is the positive right which I think was accepted by classical liberalism. But what happened next? Next we have an expansion of a different kind of rights, which can be called modern rights, and go beyond the defense of individuals against physical protection. And this expansion of positive rights mostly includes so-called social rights. And doctrine of social rights has entered the modern legislation and the legal discussion very strongly. Even though I think if you analyze the deeper intellectual justification of social rights, you may have quite a lot of doubts, especially the arch concept which is social justice. Social justice is, I think, analytically a very doubtful concept. But this is the basic for social rights, but with the expansion of the social rights. And here we have some examples. Look at UN Declaration of Human Rights. If you study that, you've noticed that classical property rights are marginalized, while you have an extensive list of social rights. Freedom rights, generally speaking, were rather marginalized. Why was so? Probably because who has signed this declaration? Many dictators. And dictators do not like freedom rights. And they would give you on paper at least a lot of social rights. Under socialism, like was, freedom rights were crimes, but social rights were okay. Social rights were granted to the individuals, but not freedom rights. Freedom rights, trying to use freedom rights, as I said, was arch crime under socialism. So I think what we have in a modern discourse is a degradation of classical rights, a focus on social rights, and you have, I like this quotation by the Belgian. And this was then, this was European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, who recognized social rights as property rights. So we have also a great intellectual confusion, I think. And not only that, this has infiltrated legislation and the practice of the courts. So when we discuss freedom, especially economic freedom to which I am coming, we should omit the issue of the taxes. Is the level of the taxes not relevant for the extent of the freedom? If so, then it would matter whether you pay 10% of your income in taxes or 100%. 100% is full communism. So obviously this would be absurd to say taxes do not matter for freedom. And the more taxes, then there is freedom unless you believe that people are just willing to pay all the taxes. Then they are not forced. This is a quotation from a great Swedish economist who just formulated the problem, fix it. If people are forced to dispense with their money, something happens to their freedom. And we are back to the welfare state. Because 70% of all the spending is social spending, so 70% of all the taxes are due to social spending. Well, I think based on this distinction between classical rights and modern rights, you can usefully try to draw the lines between three main political and intellectual directions. Social democracy in the US, I remind you, is called liberalism. And of course, the names of modern political parties do not tell much about their directions. Especially the names left and right. It would be absurd to assume that everybody called right is more, supports more freedom, and everybody called left supports less freedom, and vice versa. So I think that the names left and right, as applied to political parties, should be regarded as names of two football teams. Football teams, which are names of in Byzantium. You know, the greens and blue, so it's better to regard as greens and blue. They just want to win. But this does not convey any message, I think, any useful message about what they want to do after winning. Now I am coming to the end about different kinds of freedoms depending on the sphere of life. And to cut things short, I would say, following Schumpeter, a great Austrian economist, it's useful to define democracy as a political system which is based on political competition, as expressed in genuine and systematic elections. We know that there are many complaints about the functioning of democracy, but the complaints should refer to lack of activity of the people under the system. And I find it useful to remember what Karl Popper said during one of his last essays. And he just made an observation that under regular elections, competitive elections, called democracy, and political competition, you don't have genocides. At least I don't remember any democratic government which would organize a genocide of its own population. It's completely different from the genocide of other populations. Belgium has, under Leopold I, there were 1 million people in Congo murdered. Now this was other population, but own population. No? And you can, as Popper noted, get rid of a very bad ruler by elections. And certainly compared to what can happen and has happened under non-democracies, Mao, Stalin, Hitler, etc., it is a great advantage. But democracy does not guarantee two good things. Wide scope of economic freedom, and it does not guarantee a high level of the rule of law. I'm not going to describe the second point, so let me only mention. There are lots of definitions, as you know, of the rule of law. But I think all these definitions have at least one common element. The high level of the rule of law means that there are no elementary injustices. So prosecutors are not prosecuting innocent people, and judges are not sentencing innocent people.